Tonight's lecture by, sorry Jed, that might be your first slide. Tonight's lecture by Jed Perl is the kickoff of a two-day public convening that honors John and Kim's passion for spreading the joy of Calder to the city of Seattle, the Pacific Northwest, and our broader region. Over the last 6 months, the museum has created Calder-inspired family programs, school tours, education workshops, audio guides, playlists, online materials, and art-making activities to educate and inspire. Now with tonight's talk and the robust slate of lectures, tours, film screenings, and book signings tomorrow, the museum is deepening its exploration into the life and work of Alexander Calder. Jed, where are you? Back.
Just stay there. Stay.
For the love of God, stay there. Please. Okay. Writing about Jed Perl's biography of Alexander Calder, Fran Lebowitz, who was amazing, said, quote, "All artists are critics, but very few critics are artists. Jed Perl is one of the few." Perl was the art critic for the New Republic for 20 years. He was contributing editor at Vogue for a decade, and he is currently a regular contributor to the New York Review of Books. The poet John Ashbery has called Perl, quote, "an almost solitary, essential voice." And a reviewer in The Atlantic, discussing Perl's collection of essays, Magicians and Charlatans, observed that, quote, "he may be the finest American critic at work today in any field." Among Jed Perl's many books are Antoine's Alphabet, Eyewitness, and New Art City, a 2005 New York Times notable book. His most recent book, Authority and Freedom, a defense of the arts, kept me awake last weekend on a very early morning flight to Houston. It's actually a page-turner. Perl is also the editor of Art in America 1945 to 1970, a 900-page anthology published by the Library of America. He has written for Harper's, The New Criterion, the Threepenny Review, the Yale Review, Samagundi, and many other publications. He was the recipient of awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the American Academy in Rome, the Leon Levy Biography Center at the City University of New York, and the Ingram Merrill Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Jed Perl.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm really thrilled to be here. I saw the Shirley family collection a couple of hours ago for the first time. It's an extraordinary collection of works, just beautifully installed. This is an installation shot here, which we're going to begin with. Tonight, I want to suggest a new approach to Calder, at least an approach that I haven't taken before. Those of us who admire Calder generally emphasize the radical originality of his work, the extent to which he utterly transforms sculpture by taking something which we think of as static and making it move, making it mobile, and by taking an art form that we think of in terms of heavy stone or wooden volumes and giving us at least the illusion with these thin metal shapes that there's a lightness, a fluidity about sculpture. What I want to suggest tonight is a different way to think about Calder's originality. I want to explore the extent to which his radical creations redefined and reaffirmed some of the most ancient and fundamental aspects of sculpture. When you think about sculpture, what is sculpture really about? Sculpture is about shaping space. Sculpture is about controlling space. And when you think about the history of sculpture, think about it very, very broadly. Think first about small things, a ring, a bracelet, a pin. Those are sculptural objects. Those are small shapings of space. And then think about the macro of sculpture. think of Greek or Roman temples or medieval or Renaissance cathedrals where it's often very hard to tell where sculpture ends or sculpture begins and architecture ends. Sculpture and architecture are really merged in many of the buildings we think of as monuments of civilization. I think Calder was fascinated by the expansive possibilities of sculpture, of the sculptural project. And I would say that even Calder's fascination with the kinetic, with the mobile aspects of sculpture, actually has very, very ancient origins in thinking about sculpture among the Greeks and Romans. And what I want to talk about tonight is what I'm thinking of as Calder's radical classicism. Now, classicism is about getting to something central and essential. And I think what Calder was trying to do, even as he revolutionized sculpture, was get sculpture back to what he felt that in ancient times, in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, in the 17th, 18th century, it had been about. What he did not want was what sculpture was when he was born. Calder was born in 1898. And what you have here are photographs of galleries, sculpture galleries, from the late 19th century. On the right, you have a sculpture gallery in Italy, probably around 1870 or 80. On the left, you have a gallery in the great art school in Paris, the Beaux-Arts, probably around 1900. So Calder's born in 1898. When he was a boy, sculpture was a thing on a pedestal, okay? Generally a figure on a pedestal. Okay? And you might think about Calder as the guy who knocked sculpture off the pedestal. Okay. On the left, you have an installation shot of a show of Calder's work in Paris in 1946. And think about this. So what did Calder do? Some of the sculptures sit right on the ground, okay? They don't have a pedestal. They don't have a base. They're just right there, just plopped on the ground. Others hang from the ceiling. Calder also made sculptures that hung off the wall. And in doing this, in breaking out of this rigid structure of a figure on a pedestal, what I think Calder was trying to do was reclaim the really expansive possibilities of sculpture. Okay. On the left, you have the Port Royal, one of the entrances to Chartres Cathedral, built in the 12th century. Some of you, I'm sure here, have been to Chartres. Chartres is a town about an hour outside of Paris. And this is what sculpture was like in the Middle Ages in a cathedral or a church. Sculpture enveloped you, okay? It's not just sitting there on a pedestal. It's on the walls. It's on the ceiling. It's above you. On the right, you have a work that Calder created in Caracas, Venezuela, in the 1950s, in an auditorium the university designed. The auditorium of the university was designed by a friend of his, an architect named Villanueva. And Calder was asked by his friend to do something for the university. And his friend suggested, well, maybe you should do a sculpture for in front of the auditorium. And Calder said, no, I want to be in the auditorium. And Calder came up with the idea of creating this acoustic ceiling made up of these clouds that extend from the ceiling onto the walls. And in doing this, okay, this is this incredibly modern language. And in one sense, you think of it as completely different from Christ in Glory at Chartres Cathedral. But I think in some deep way, what Calder is trying to do here is recapture this sense of sculpture as an enveloping experience, an experience that merges with architecture. And in fact, Calder was fascinated by architects. He had many friends who were architects. He loved working with architects. One of the things I'm going to talk about a little bit now and again in the next hour is works of art, old works of art, sometimes ancient works of art, that really interested Calder. And I want to sort of give you a sense of what it is in these older things that fascinate him. On the left, you have a carving, a 7th century carving from India, depicting the descent of the Ganges. The Ganges River came down from heaven to earth, and that sort of in the center, you see the Ganges River coming down to earth. Now, this sculpture in India is carved in live rock. It's actually carved in 2 big boulders. And when Calder saw it, when he visited India in the 50s, he was fascinated by it. I know this because I talked to a painter, an Indian painter who's now in his 90s, and he told me about when he was a young man, Calder talked to him about this. Now, what interested Calder about it? Again, the fact that it breaks out of that rigid idea of what a sculpture is, a sculpture being a figure on a pedestal. And the kind of expansive sense of sculpture that you have in The Descent from the Ganges is something you feel in on the right. You have a late work by Calder, a work called Universe, which was created in the 1970s for the Sears Tower in Chicago. Again, think about this. The sculpture here is on the floor. It comes down from the ceiling. It's on the wall. It is sculpture occupying our space in a very fresh, fluid, imaginative way. One of the interesting things about the way Calder talked about sculpture was he generally talked about his work not as sculpture, but as objects. And I think part of what he was doing by doing that was trying to get away from that idea of the sculpture on the pedestal. And he wanted to have a much more kind of open and fluid concept of what it was to make sculpture. So in Calder's career, you go from something like this tiny pin, okay, which is like this big, that you see on the right. This is a pin made in the 1940s. To on the left, a fountain that's in Michigan that he designed in the 50s based on ideas of his that went back to the 1930s. Now, so this gives you the sort of the full range of what Calder conceives as the sculptural project. Again, everything from the micro to the macro, and it's not just making volumes, but making incursions into space, which could be even made with water. And in fact, as we'll see toward the end of this evening, this fascination with water, with fountains as sculptural objects is something that Calder has in common with some of the great sculptors of the Renaissance and the Baroque period. So when you go through there's collection, this wonderful collection here at the museum, and there are enormous things and there are tiny things, but it's all part of this very, very rich interaction with the entire environment. Sculpture is moving in different directions. Now, partly these interests of Calder's, this sense he has of the broadness of what sculpture is part of his birthright. Calder came from a family of artists. His father, whose name was Alexander Sterling Calder, but went by Sterling Calder, was one of the, who you see a work by him on the right here, was one of the best-known American sculptors in the first quarter of the 20th century. His mother, Nanette Lederer Calder, was a very serious painter. And his paternal grandfather, who went by Alexander Milne Calder, and you see an enormous sculpture of William Penn by him on the left. His grandfather was very prominent in Philadelphia in the last decades of the 19th century when he designed the hundreds of sculptures that are on the Philadelphia City Hall, which is this marvelous Victorian wedding cake of a building. Now, both Calder's grandfather, paternal grandfather, and father, the focus of their work was public sculpture. In other words, not, again, the figure on the pedestal in the gallery, but their focus was a kind of sculpture that moves out into the world. So partly Calder's eagerness to have that expansive sense of sculpture, I think, comes from his family. The work on the right was actually one that his father made. It's called The Fountain of Energy, made for the Panama Pacific Exposition in San Francisco in 1915. So Calder, at that point, as a teenager, watching his father, who was the man who oversaw all sculptural projects at the Panama Pacific Exposition. So this sense of the possibilities of sculpture is sort of there as part of his birthright. And in fact, his father, when he wrote about sculpture, talked about it in terms that you feel echoed in a way in Calder's own thinking, because his father talked about sculpture as a living art, and he said it's an outdoor art, and it should be developed as part of sort of the broader experience of life, which I think was very much something that Calder picked up on. Calder was very lucky as a kid to have parents who encouraged his creativity. And his parents, the family lived in Pasadena, California, actually, when Calder was 9 and 10, 11 years old. I mean, it's funny, people often think, Calder was born in Philadelphia, and people often think of Calder as a Philadelphia guy. Though Calder himself sometimes said kind of quietly to people, I don't really like Philadelphia. But interestingly enough, and this is sort of, I think, is a nice thing for all of you in Seattle, Calder spent a lot of time in his first 18 years on the West Coast in California. And I've sometimes wondered, as somebody who myself grew up partly in California, that something about the kind of freedom of the Mobile, that whole sense of expansiveness, there's something about it, I think, that came a little bit from that West Coast air he breathed as a kid. In any event, in Pasadena, when he was 9 or 10, he's this very bright, creative boy. His parents were very encouraging of this. They always made sure he had a workshop where he could make things. And a lot of the people in their circle in Pasadena were very much parts of the arts and crafts movement, which I'm sure many of you know a lot about. And so the ideas of the great English theorist John Ruskin were very much in the air. And of course, Ruskin had this idea that in the Middle Ages, creativity sort of bubbled up from anybody who had a chisel. And Ruskin wrote that sculpture in the Middle Ages was a sign of the life and liberty of every workman who struck a stone, a freedom of thought and rank and scale of being, such as no laws, no charters, no charities can secure. So for Ruskin, and his ideas were definitely in the air in Southern California, this arts and crafts world, there was a sense that that making things was this expansive activity. It wasn't just a sculpture that goes in a gallery, but it was just imagining things. So Calder, I think under the influence probably of a man named Donaldson, a metal worker who I think was a friend of Calder's parents, Calder did when he was 9 or about 10 years old, we think, these two little tiny, couple of inches high, animals you see on the left, a dog and a duck. The dog, Calder himself thought these were so important that when he had his first retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1943, that little dog was included in that show. So these beginnings were very, very important to him. Just again to emphasize this sense of the sculptural experiment is very expansive. you see on the left a doorway to a home that friends of Calder's parents were building near Los Angeles in these years when they lived down there. And look at the metalwork on that doorway, this ironwork, okay? And then look on the right, this is a napkin clip that Calder made in the 1940s, okay? So the memory of this sort of arts and crafts idea of the freedom of the creative act was always there in Calder. Jump ahead to the 1920s. Calder first goes to Paris in 1926. He's almost turning 28. He's already been to college. He went to college to study engineering, then he decided he didn't want to be an engineer, and then he kind of bummed around for a few years. His parents were freaking out. They had this brilliant, creative kid who couldn't seem to decide what he wanted to do with his life. And then finally he decided, okay, I'm going to become an artist like my parents. And in some way, I think he'd fought it for a while because he wanted to break out in some new direction. But he realized this was for him. He studied at the Art Students League in New York, and he arrives in Paris. And many of you, I'm sure, have seen these elements from the Calder circus, which are now, behind plexiglass or whatever, in cases at the Whitney Museum of American Art in New York. But the way people originally experienced the circus, beginning in 1926, when Calder had a little hotel room on the Rue de Guerre on the left bank, the way people experienced the circus was not as objects in a case, but as these 8 or so inch high figures and elements that this rather large, kind of charming but awkward American guy manipulated, getting on his hands and knees and getting them to jump and do this and that. And this idea of the tactility, okay, of what he's doing here is very, very important. One of the frustrating things about seeing Calder today and seeing Calder in this magnificent exhibit here is you're not allowed to blow on them, you're not allowed to touch them, you're not allowed to push them, all of which are things that Calder wanted you to do. On the left you have a photograph of Calder from a clip from a film from the 1960s with Calder blowing on little mobiles. And here, this is a case here, a case of these wonderful, tiny, small, standing mobiles here with someone looking in, and of course, what one wants to do is touch it, okay? One wants to push it. One wants to see what happens. And that is very much at the core, the real ancient core of what sculptural experience is about. I mean, we go to museums all the time and it's do not touch, don't you, but I mean, when you see a very smooth marble sculpture, don't you want to put out your fingers and feel the texture of it, or you want to see with a rougher kind of stone, you want to feel what that's like. Part of the sculptural experience at its core is tactile. And indeed, until the 1960s, you could touch Calder's. This is a photograph on the right of a show at the Kurt Valentin Gallery in the 1950s where Calder exhibited. You can see two women blowing on the mobile. In the 60s, a composer named Earl Brown actually asked Calder to make a standing mobile that could be used as a percussion instrument. And Calder made the work you see on the left. And Brown created something he called the Calder piece, which has 4 percussion instrumentalists, each at a stand with a lot of percussion instruments. And then in the middle is the Calder standing mobile, which they go in and bang. And there's a whole complicated idea about how the mobile moves affects how they what they then play. But interestingly, the first time Calder saw this performed, afterwards they say, "What did you think?" He said, "You didn't bang it hard enough," okay? So this idea of the tactility, the direct interaction is very important to Calder. And I would argue that this is a very, very ancient aspect of what sculpture is supposed to be about. There are a whole bunch of portraits from the Renaissance and Baroque period in which you see people touching or holding little works of sculpture. This is what Calder's little mobiles were intended for. On the right, you have a portrait by Veronese of a sculptor by the name of Alessandro Vittoria, and you see how he's sort of like clutching, grasping this sculpture of his. On the left, you have a painting by a Venetian painter, Lorenzo Lotto, of a collector named Andrea Odoni, and he is actually clutching a figure of Diana of Ephesus, which is a goddess, a multi-breasted goddess. So there's actually something kind of, he's clutching this kind of symbol of female energy and fertility. So there, sculpture is, in some ways, sculpture is much more sensual and sensuous than painting, because sculpture is like out there in the world. Again, on the right, a portrait by Bronzino of a young man who's almost like petting this sculpture of a woman. And on the left, you have a figure of Venus, the goddess of love. There was a whole series of these beginning in Greek times, and then most of what we have now are Roman copies. But in Pliny's history, he actually talks about statues of Venus in sanctuaries where, as he puts it, there were stains on them from male worshipers who got so excited that they left stains on the statues. Okay, so now I'm not saying that Calder is asking for that kind of reaction, but when Calder in the early 30s did the sculpture you see on the left, Object with Red Ball, this is a sculpture in which you actually can move the elements. The red ball can be slid along that dowel, and the dowel can be moved up and down. And he was actually inviting the audience to interact, to touch. Now, I mean, obviously, we're talking about a completely different kind of vocabulary and realm of pictorial discourse than we see on the right. But nonetheless, the idea of engagement with these objects which are in the real world is incredibly, incredibly important to Calder. Many of you probably know the story of Pygmalion and Galatea, okay, which then became the basis for a play by Bernard Shaw and then My Fair Lady. It comes from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And you see on the left a painting by the 19th century French painter Gérôme. Pygmalion is a sculptor, and he makes a sculpture in ivory of Galatea. And he's just wild about this sculpture. Okay? And he's falling in love with the sculpture. And he goes and prays to Venus. And Venus brings the sculpture to life. And I'm going to read you a few lines from Ovid. Often he, that's Pygmalion, stretched forth a hand to touch his creation, attempting to settle the issue. Was it a living body, or was it, this he would not yet concede, a mere statue? And then once Venus has given him his wish, suddenly the statue softened and, losing its stiffness, yielded, submitting to his caress as wax softens when it is warmed by the sun and handled by fingers. Now, think about a mobile. A mobile is a still thing that is animated by the air or by the push of a hand. And indeed, there's a wonderful series of photographs by Calder's friend Herbert Matter from the 1930s. This is a photograph by Matter of a work called, indeed, Dancers in Sphere. And what Matter shows us, in a way, in these photographs, is this thing that Calder, that Pygmalion is dreaming of. How do you bring sculpture to life? So even this radical move into the kinetic that Calder engages in as a revolutionary modern artist is, I think, grounded in some very ancient longing to make the static alive, to bring something to life. And then I would go back to Calder's Sir Calder, think of marionettes and puppets and automatons. That whole tradition, which goes back to the ancient world, is very, very much something that fascinated Calder. So there's this sense of the real becoming ineffable, more than real, the sort of decentering of the material, of dematerializing the material. And it's very, very much what the Calder mobile is about. And again, it ties into a very old ambition in sculpture. And on the right, you have something I'm sure many of you have seen and know. This is what many regard as the greatest work by the 17th century Baroque Roman sculptor Bernini. This is the Ecstasy of St. Teresa in the Cornaro Chapel at Santa Maria della Victoria. And St. Teresa was a Spanish saint who wrote about her ecstatic experiences with God, which she described in terms of a beautiful angel coming to her with an arrow and plunging the arrow into her continuously. And we, modern people who sex is all we think about, of course, to us, this seems like she just, she's talking about the sex she hasn't had. But Bernini's point was to convey through the hardness of marble this lifting up. And notice, all you actually see of St. Teresa is her face, her hand, and a foot. And the rest of it is this torrent of drapery. And so there's a sense, and talk about pedestals, the pedestal is denied here. It's as if the entire sculpture floats. And it's very much this kind of way of thinking that I believe Calder is embracing in these large hanging mobiles, like this is one that's here, Gamma from 1947, where is it going down or is it going up, or is it going this way or that way? It's as if material things, these pieces of metal, have been sort of released into another kind of sense of movement and possibility. And again, it goes to something very deep and primal in us about a release from the worldly, from the heaviness of the worldly experience, a release into a kind of lightness and openness. And interestingly enough, Calder was a secular man. His wife once said that he was the least spiritual person she had ever met. Okay, but he had a friend in Mexico, a man by the name of Marius Gertz, who was very interested in modern religious architecture. And they had, over a period of years, discussions about whether a mobile, particularly a white-on-white mobile, and you have a big one up here in the Shirley collection, could be used on an altar, above the altar in a Catholic church or cathedral, as a symbol of the Holy Spirit. And Calder was like, well, I don't know, I'm a secular guy, I'm not Catholic, but he never completely said no. And I think that was because he sensed that there was a way in which these works of his connect to yearnings for the transcendent, for the release from our gravitationally earthbound lives. Just to stay with this thought of Baroque art for 1 minute, the right, you have a detail from an amazing altarpiece in Lisbon, Spain, which in a way I'm just showing it because I saw it only a few weeks ago. And this is just a fragment from this altarpiece by a guy named Narciso Tomé. But notice how, again, the sculptural elements are dispersed. You have these angel heads popping up, and even these like leaf forms that are sort of fluttering around. And look at that with the wonderful dispersed objects with brass gong that's upstairs. And again, that sense of dispersing the sculptural experience, not having it coalesce into one solid, but opening it up, is very, very much something that Calder wanted to do, that connects with this very ancient sense of expanding the sculpture. Now I want to just take you through a few works older works of art that I know Calder saw and was interested in, and it can connect them in various ways with his work. And then this is actually going to move us into talking a little bit in conclusion about some of the monumental works that preoccupied him so much in his later years. Calder had an Italian curator and critic friend named Carandente, and they would kind of rampage around Italy seeing things. And one of the things they saw was a park that had been developed in the 16th century near Rome, which has gotten the name the Monsters of Bomarzo, where you had these very, very strange sculptures that just sort of almost seemed to erupt out of the ground. And look at this with a marvelous Calder from 1960 called The City, here installed in the courtyard in the Museum of Modern Art in Caracas. This sense of thinking about sculpture casually, again, not as something with all the pomp and circumstance of a fancy pedestal, and it's got to be there to show it's important. Calder liked the idea that it's kind of just plunked there. It's just there. And in fact, this is something that interested younger artists too. Donald Judd, the minimalist sculptor who many of you know his work. Judd, who wrote some criticism in the early 60s, actually praised Calder for getting rid of the pedestal in that. And Judd said, and he could have said it about something like this, he liked the fact that Calder's work is sitting on the floor, not on a base, casually taking care of itself. Now, Calder wrote an autobiography, and he tells about a lot of his travels. And I think people have not taken these accounts as seriously as they should have. Because when you really look carefully and think about what Calder talks about, noticing, you realize that he's constantly feeding on older art. So he mentions at some point that he's in Damascus, and there are a couple of mosques there that he says have this really cool striped painting on the walls in like orange and white or orange and black and white. And like I thought, gee, that's interesting. So I went looking around, and then indeed, here are these mosques. And then you go from that to some of the late Calders, where he's using a lot of different colors, like this fabulous Grand Crinkly here from 1971. And by God, he's drawing on this ancient Middle Eastern idea of polychrome decoration in architecture and bringing that into his sculpture. This is a work on the left that's beautifully displayed here, an untitled work from 1943. I had a revelation about works like the one on the left when I was in Istanbul for the first time about 8 months ago. there are a lot of Calders which have these really weird juxtapositions of size and shape. So you have this like kind of thick volume, this big black thing down there, and then you have this crazy little weedsy thing that goes up and up and up. And you think, what is going on here? And if you think about this in terms of sort of Western, Greco-Roman, European ideas about architectural form, it doesn't make much sense, because in the Greco-Roman and European tradition, architectural form tends to be concentrated, okay? And even if you think of cathedrals, it's like they kind of concentrate and then the towers and the spires. But there is this tradition in the Middle East and the East, this is the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, of having this juxtaposition of this very dense mass, which is the mosque itself, and then these skinny minarets. And indeed, there are mosques, smaller mosques, that will have only one minaret, so we'll feel very close to what you see on the left. But again, this is Calder feeding off of older ideas about engaging space. And he comes up with something that seems to us like utterly modern, and yet it's coming out of these ancient sources. Calder had a list of, I don't know, 4 or 5 artists he loved. One of them was Paul Klee, and I have to say, any of you who are going to be in New York in the next weeks, there is an astonishing Calder and Klee show at the Dodona Gallery. If you're in New York before it goes down, I think in June it goes down, yes? If you're in New York before June 7th, it is a knockout, astonishing, great show. Another artist on Calder's list of passions was Hieronymus Bosch, whose most famous work from around 1500 is the Garden of Earthly Delights. And the middle panel of the Garden of Earthly Delights on the top, there are these bizarre, crazy towers, okay? This is like fantasy architecture on acid, okay? And nobody really understands, nobody has ever been able to fully explain what Bosch's Garden of Earthly Delights is all about. But Calder loved it. And if you look at a group of Calder standing mobiles from the mid-1940s, I'm like, wow, okay? Because he's riffing on this. He's like doing a duet with this work by Bosch. Again, drawing on older ideas, and particularly here, he's drawing on ideas about how do you make a kind of tower-like, central focus-like architectural, sculptural thing, okay, that can be done on a large scale, that could kind of bring people's attention to it. And he's thinking about, I think, minarets. He's thinking about all kinds of towers, medieval towers. And he begins, this is the kind of stuff he's wanted to do since he was a young man in the 1930s, but he didn't really have the opportunities. But beginning in the 60s, with sort of post-war boom, he starts to have these opportunities to make these works which engage with the social world, the broad social world. And one of the first is done for Spoleto, Italy, where there's a festival, an art, music, dance festival that begins in the years after World War II, the Festival of Two Worlds. And he designs this enormous work, which is called Teo Dell'Appio for Spoleto. In a way, he's going back to his father's ambitions, because his father did large monumental sculpture. But he's also going back to what is one of the fundamental obligations of sculpture, You think of things, the Colossus of Rhodes, these sort of mythical monuments, many of them lost. You think of, if you go to Rome and there are like fragments of monumental, enormous, many, many times over life-size sculptures of emperors and rulers. But with a difference, Calder and his friends, starting in the 1940s, talked a lot about the post-war world, a world when fascism had been defeated. What should public art be like? And one of his very good friends, a critic and curator named James Johnson Sweeney, said, we don't want to have sculptures which are of people. We don't want to have sculptures of the prince. We're not even so sure we want to have sculptures of a great president like Abraham Lincoln. What we want to have are monumental works that are free in some way, that a free democratic populace can engage with openly. And that was the mission that Calder really took for himself. It became very central to his work in his later years. On the left, you see a major work done for Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1969, La Grande Vitesse, which actually became a kind of key to the revitalization of downtown Grand Rapids. On the right, you have a sculpture called El Sol Rojo, the Red Sun, an ancient Mexican idea, which was done for the Olympics in Mexico City in 1968. Again, works that riff on this very ancient idea of the monumental sculpture, but do it in this way that has a kind of openness of meaning. So we're invited to engage freely, to think our own thoughts, to dream our own dreams. I think one of the struggles, and again, this goes back to ancient times, the medieval and Renaissance times. One of the struggles sculptors with these kind of ambitions always have is you have to have the right place, you have to have the right collaborators. And for Calder, I think it really, really finally came together once toward the very end of his life. He died in 1976. 1973, he got a commission for Chicago. And in Chicago, where Mies van der Rohe, the great German-born architect, was living, Mies van der Rohe had been working on a project for a federal center. You see a model of it on the right, with a very low building that's a post office, and then an office building, and then across the street, a court building. And so it's this group of 3 buildings, downtown Chicago, in this superb, elegant, stark, somewhat saturnine, black, Miesian style. And Calder gets the commission, and in the middle of this, he invents this red, actually it was an idea he'd been thinking about, and people who came from Chicago saw a small study, and they said, well, let's work on this. And Calder created this work which he ended up calling Flamingo, this red, strange behemoth, which is, it's sort of part architecture, part animal, part insect, and yet it's called Flamingo. And he made alterations, and actually he wanted it moved into a slightly different relationship with the other buildings. And if you are in Chicago, go to Federal Center and stand there, because this is one of these urban miracles where people actually can enter and leave this space from multiple directions. And it's right in the thick of Chicago, of working Chicago. So all day, people are moving back and forth and around and through this thing. And what you have here in Chicago, in a completely modern language, is something that I think can only bear comparison with the pinnacles of urban architectural, sculptural expression, of which, and many of you recognize this from the right, the Piazza Navona in Rome, where you have Bernini's great fountain, and the church just right there behind, you see behind the fountain, is by the great 17th century Roman architect Borromini. But that idea of sculpture as part of life, something that interacts, that almost seems to be actively interacting with us in the world. That's at the core of Calder's ambition, and it's something that comes from deep in the history of sculpture. You might say in the DNA of sculpture. Calder is speaking his own language here, a language full of modern ambiguities, open-ended. But the fundamental urge to mark out an urban space, to create a focal point, a gathering place, to shape space, this is among the most fundamental, ancient, radically classical things that an artist can do. Thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to do some questions if there's a desire, therefore.
Yeah, we're good on time.
We're recording this, so if you would raise your hand, we'll bring you the microphone.
Hello. A friend of mine, a sculptor, was telling me one day about sculpting needing to ground into the earth as well as reach into the sky. And I'm wondering how his mobiles relate to that, if it makes sense.
Well, the later stabiles, you know, these huge, not so much flamingo, but there are some that are, especially ones. Well, you have one actually upstairs, the big black one as you come in with the triangular forms. There are a group there are Calders, particularly I would say from the last years of his life, where you have these kind of very earthbound forms. Calder had Parkinson's in his later years, and I think that he actually became interested at the end in the idea of being weighted down. So I think there is that aspect, but you could also say that in a way the mobile always contains its opposite. The idea of getting off the ground contains the weight. And Calder himself was a kind of a heavy guy. He'd always had a weight problem. For a time in his 30s and his 40s, he would go on these diets and try to fight it. He was a somewhat heavy guy who was light on his feet. He was a wonderful dancer. He was very deft with his fingers. So even in his own being, there was a kind of tension, you might say, between being weighted down and also being able to kind of take off. So I think he probably would have been sympathetic to that sense of things. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I was really interested in how Calder decided to call his sculptures objects. And as you continued talking, you mentioned what I saw as basically fetish objects in history, in ancient Greece and Rome. And you also talked about transcendence and things that I see as ephemeral and immaterial. And I'm wondering if maybe you could talk more about this concept of the object versus the immaterial, and especially, for me, I don't know if this relates to Calder, but many of the French theorists of the time, like Gaston Bachelard and Henri Lefebvre, were sort of blurring the boundaries between idealism and materialism, for example.
Well, I think the fact that he preferred the word object to sculpture connects with other preferences he had. He didn't like to talk about his studio. He talked about his workshop, okay? So on the one hand, there was an interesting kind of taking things down to the basics, okay? But if you think about Ruskin and you think about the arts and crafts movement, of course, there is an idea there, and it's certainly an idea that all people who are attracted to the art of the Middle Ages feel that the material and the immaterial are somehow connected. And you talk about fetish objects, of course, the actuality that you worship, that you touch or pray to, is supposed to take you to something something else. But yes, when you ask about, so yes, I think that it's like it's two sides of the same coin is probably the way to think about it. And also, Bachelard, I would argue that any of this sort of French philosophic ideas, even if Calder never talked about them, he was sitting at dinners where they were all discussed and he thought about them. That would be my feeling. We do know that he was very, in the late 20s and early 30s, there was a lot of interest in Parisian circles, in dimensions beyond the dimensions we live in 4th, 5th, and 6th, people like Ouspensky, the Russian mystic. There was a lot of interest in that kind of stuff, and I think that stuff absolutely is there in Calder's work. So the idea that you, that you go from 2 dimensions to 3, and then there's a jump. I mean, Calder's, one of his favorite forms was the spiral, okay? And the spiral is, of course, a shape that with all kinds of suggestions of moving beyond, of infinity. So I think that all those ideas are sort of knotted up there. For Calder, the question is, how do you render all of this as a physical actuality? This actuality that has this suggestibility. I think that's what he's after.
Thank you for framing the art historical dimension of his work and so far back in time. And you've also talked about the social settings, but what was it about his work, the deeper interior psychological aspects, that was so attracted to the surrealists? Or were they on the wrong track?
Were the surrealists on the wrong track?
In terms of what they admired about him?
Well, I think Calder, of course, was, I should say Calder, the question is, what was Calder's relationship with the surrealists? The surrealists took an interest in Calder. Calder was very ambivalent about being labeled a surrealist, more than ambivalent. He really didn't like it. I think what interested the surrealists about Calder was, and we were talking about this a little bit at dinner, this question of play. And, Calder has sort of been cursed by the ubiquity of mobiles, and people still think, Calder, that's that thing that is over baby's crib, and Calder is playful and Calder is fun. And part of what's unfortunate about that is that the idea of play is actually a very, very serious idea in Western thought, in Western philosophy, and it's an idea that. Well, there are many. It has many versions, but it's an idea about what experience is and how you experience the world and how people experience one another, and how by kind of reaching out from what you exactly know and seeing how things interact or how two people interact. People play, children play together, or you could say lovers will be playful. You're trying to see where your borders end, and how then you might interact with others. The great Dutch historian and theorist Huizinga wrote a book called Homo Ludens, Man Who Plays, in which he said, play is the core of civilization. Play is what prevents you from having war. People have to know how to interact and listen to other people and play with one another. So in that, I think that's what the surrealists interested in, and the sense that a mobile is a play. A mobile is a play of forms. It's a family of forms, and they play with each other, and if you watch a mobile move, they interact differently at different times. So I think that's what interested the surrealists about him. What Calder, I think, didn't like about surrealism was the sort of this constant plunging in what you claimed was the sort of deep id of truth. And Calder didn't think that was where truth was not necessarily in the worst nightmare you'd ever had. Truth was also in a dance party and how you interacted with people. So he didn't like the kind of dark Freudian theorizing of the surrealists. That was not his kind of thing.
Thank you.
Maybe a couple more questions?
That was a wonderful lecture, Jed. I really
you, Beth.
appreciated
Thank
it.
you.
Really opened up many different things to think about. And so I was just wondering about this idea about the apparent asceticism of Calder's sculpture, the planar forms, versus what we've always thought about the Baroque as being much more sensuous and touchable and textural. And I'm reminded of what Calder's father said about his work, that it was actually a complaint he had about Sandy's work. Do you remember that?
No, tell me, I'm not.
He said that he didn't see Calder's sculptures as touchable, and he always thought of sculpture as
yes.
touchable.
But that, of course, was very early, I believe. Did he say that about the wire sculpture, I think, maybe?
I'm trying to remember. I knew you would ask that.
I think
and so I'm trying to remember. I thought it came in the at the end of his father's
at the moment,
life.
sure, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I have a feeling it came at the end.
I mean, I think, like, see, I defy anybody to go up and see your wonderful collection and not want to break into one of those cases and just hold one of those little things and twirl it around and indeed I know there's one journalist account of the Calders were in Jerusalem and a journalist went to visit him to interview him and Calder had a mobile that he was actually going to give to somebody in Jerusalem, a little mobile, standing mobile. And the interviewer says that Calder was sitting there like playing with it, holding it. So I think there is the austerity. I think Calder, there are many different kinds of Calders, I would say. There are shockingly austere Calders, but also, for instance, the dispersed objects with gong, mobile upstairs, with all that color and those differently shaped forms. That is an incredibly opulent work. I have to say, one of the things I adore about Calder is how many different things he did. One of my personal frustrations with various artists, is take Mark Rothko. There are absolutely wonderful Mark Rothkos, but after a certain point, there is a way a Mark Rothko is. And Calder, to me, is somebody who is constantly challenging what's possible. And in his later years, he goes back to doing all kinds of wacky figures, which in a way are done in the 70s that are in a way connected with things he had done back in the 20s. I mean, it's an incredibly rich and varied body of work, which is one of the things that makes it such a pleasure to explore and makes it so rich for an exhibition like this, because there's so many different kinds of things with different kinds of moods.
Hi. Are there any other examples of here, like what happened in Caracas, to solve one problem? I think that was like acoustics or something related with sound.
I'm sorry.
Is there like another example of
like the acoustic.
yeah, in Caracas?
That's the only, that may be the acoustic ceiling in Caracas, may be the sort of the case, I think perhaps of sculpture most fully integrated with architecture. Which Calder talked about as one of the works that meant the most to him. And one of the problems here with these large works and with collaborative works is, of course, the parts have to come together. It's a little bit like trying to make a movie. You know what I mean? You have to have the planets have to be aligned. So I think there are a lot of things. I think there are a lot of things Calder may have wanted to do or thought about doing. And that's certainly true. There are projects for monumental sculptures that never came close to being realized. But Caracas, again, and this was a case, Calder had a great gift for friendship, and Raúl Villanueva, the great Venezuelan architect who designed this enormous, amazing university, was friends not just with Calder, but with Leger, with Vasarely, with Arp, with all kinds of younger Venezuelan artists, and they all did work for this amazing university in Caracas, which is at the moment, of course, very difficult to visit because of the pitiful state of Venezuela. I went there about a decade ago. It's just an amazing place. But it was I would say it was a rare case with him, as in a different way I feel that the Federal Center in Chicago was, of a great architect and a great artist coming together.
I wonder if you could comment on his use of color. Did he have a few favorites, or what was some of his thinking behind it?
Well, he always talked about red, black and red were his favored colors for large works. He tended to experiment more with a variety of color in smaller works, though that grand crinkly, which I showed you, is an exception. But one of the things I didn't talk that much about is the issue of polychrome in his work, colored sculpture, which of course is a very, very ancient thing. And to my mind, he's virtually only the only 20th century artist who does it successfully. Arp does it sometimes. I have to say, I do not think David Smith's experiments with colored sculpture are particularly successful. But Calder, I think, is brilliant. And there are smaller sculptures, including ones upstairs, with many different colors on them, or a number of different colors. One of the things he does is, he tends to, again, not absolutely always, but almost always, he doesn't want to put more than one color on one plane. So there's that little crinkly animal upstairs, is that a snake? What? Crocodile. There's a little crocodile case there from the early 70s, I believe. And that is like one of these wonderful bent metal things. And basically each plane is a different color. But the color respects the shape, okay? Again, there are exceptions, but basically that's what he does. I think he's a brilliant, brilliant colorist. He's also a prolific painter, okay? And one of the things, I think, if you look at Calder a lot, one of the things you realize is he often works out ideas in paint or in later years in gouache on paper, water-based medium, before he even tries them in sculpture. He tends to think, and I think he's right, that he was a guy with like the craziest, wackiest ideas. I think I'll do 20 pink elephants, and he'll do it as a gouache, or I'm going to do like stringy people who seem to be melting, and he'll do it as a gouache, but he'll think, well, that may look stupid big as a sculpture. So often the works on paper are a way of thinking through ideas that sometimes 5 or 10 or 15 years later you'll see sort of reappearing in sculpture. But I think the use of color is absolutely brilliant and deft in the work. He's a great colorist, I think. Anything more? Beryl, you want to?
Well, thank you for a wonderful lecture, Jed.
Thank you.
I'm so interested in this connection between his sculpture and architectural space, and I'm just thinking about it in terms of site specificity,
Right.
and also, you know, the much smaller, more intimate pieces that he made for specific places. So I wonder if you could speak to what you think of as the significance and origin of his, you know, fascination with site specificity.
You see, you get the tough questions from the Calder experts, you see. What are you thinking about specifically? What case are you thinking about specifically?
Well, I mean, this in a large scale, but I was thinking also, you know, for the staircase mobile that he made.
Right, there's the one at the Museum of Modern Art. I think it also, maybe what we're getting at here is site-specific for him is also about time and space. So certain places, like you say, a staircase, I mean, the idea of the procession of going up and down a staircase and then how a work that moves in that space is aligned with that. I mean, this is a guy he and his wife loved to dance. They loved dancing parties. And if you think of dancing and the rhythm, and especially the rhythm of two people dancing together, and I think the idea of how do you make something that isn't just in a space, but adds to the space, commands the space, engages in a dynamic relationship with the space. And it doesn't always work, frankly, but sometimes I have to say, just go back. One of the real surprises to me, this thing, El Sol Rojo, which is still, by the way, in Mexico City near the stadium, this wonderful pattern on the plaza is no longer there. But this thing is in a very kind of rough area of Mexico, way outside of Mexico, the center of Mexico City, with ugly roads around it. But this thing commands the space. And also, it is in a very interesting relationship with the architecture of the stadium. Notice the way the kind of curving of the concrete on the stadium. He is, and that was, what's the architect's name? Do you remember I can't remember his name at the moment. Anyway, this is a very, very interesting Mexican architect. Calder knew what was going up there, and he's in this kind of conversation. That's what he longed for, that kind of conversation with another artist. It's like, you know, when people talk about great opera productions and like, why do 9/10 of the performances of Mozart or Beethoven, you know, Mozart operas fail? Because you don't have the right combination of conductor, orchestra, you know, soprano, setting, you know. And that's kind of sometimes what Calder was up against in these things, where we've got to get everybody together at the right time. But there are extraordinary things. And at MoMA, you can still, the great Calder mobile there still hangs where it was meant for, in a staircase there, so you can see that. But there are also private things. There's actually an amazing mobile in an amazing home, private home, sort of villa in Caracas, which I saw, which was still there at least a few years ago, which again was, it wasn't conceived for the space, but it was chosen for the space. So those kind of synergies are really wonderful, yeah. Should we, I don't, what do you want to do? You tell me when we're done, or.
Okay, well, this will be our last question.
Would you comment, you mentioned Donald Judd, but wasn't there a general chilling of critical opinion about Calder on the part of Judd and some of his colleagues?
Well,
and
it's...
How did that affect Calder?
You know, I would say Calder's reputation is a very complicated story. Calder although he was not making money from his work until really making money until sometime well into the 50s, he had a retrospective at the Museum of Modern Art in 1943 that was an enormous event, very, very successful, very popular. It bred resentment, I would say, among younger artists. A lot of the abstract expressionists were very interested in what he was doing, but didn't quite want to admit it, I would say. And that kind of, in my view, that continues into the 60s. The truth is, I believe that Don Judd and a lot of the young sculptors thinking about site-specific and more monumental sculpture in the 60s were looking at Calder. Marc de Souverault is somebody who acknowledged it openly. Judd wrote actually sympathetically about Calder's work. But they also felt that by then Calder was this kind of national monument, and they were like going to be the avant-garde. Calder's attitude toward the whole thing was, I'm a lucky man, I can do my work, I'm getting more and more opportunities, and time will tell. I genuinely think that was his feeling about it. He would let fate decide, and he was right. He was right. Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Jed Perl.